You might be thinking of coming to Canada as a student, and one of your questions might be, can I cover my expenses by working here as a student? So in this video today, I'm going to try and answer this question, and I'm also going to do some simulations, give you some number examples if you miscalculate what your living costs here are going to be and how much you can earn as a student. There is a risk that you run out of money and then you'll not be able to complete your studies, and in the worst case, you will even need to return to your home country, and that's certainly not something that you want. And that is why it's really important to do a realistic calculation, but we'll get to that later. So, money is always a concern, and when you're planning to immigrate to Canada, you need to make sure that you have enough money prepared. For the purpose of this video, I will just assume that you already have funds prepared to cover your tuition. So here in this video, I want to focus on the living costs, and I'll use the example of Toronto. So let's just start off by talking about how much it roughly costs for one single person to live in the very expensive city of Toronto. If we look at this website, numbeo.com, which is a website that provides statistics about cost of living all around the world, you can see here that it's estimated that a single person's monthly costs are $1,393.90 without rent. So let's just say $1,400, $1,400 without rent. And I would say that this is pretty reasonable, but rather on the lower side. It's super easy to get above this number. So this $1,400 without rent will just barely cover your very basic living costs. So you will need to adopt a relatively frugal lifestyle to keep within this budget. But I would say that $1,400 for a single person, for a student, is quite realistic and livable. But what about rent? Let's just assume that your monthly rent living here in Toronto is $1,200, and that is not for your own apartment above the ground, but that is for either a shared apartment shared with another tenant, for example a friend, another student, and so on, or you rent a unit that is located in the basement, or a basement unit, and usually that unit will be located further away from the city. That is what you realistically get for $1,200. By the way guys, if you're about to come to Canada and you're wondering about how you can find an affordable apartment here in Toronto, then you might want to check out this video here, which is a 5-step guide for beginners to find an affordable apartment here in Toronto, and you can watch this after you finish watching this video. So guys, if we take that number, $1,400 plus $1,200 rent, that amounts to $2,600 per month. If we multiply that by 12, that's $31,200. And no matter where you're from in the world, that is quite a lot of money for one person. By the way guys, if you found this video useful so far and you're enjoying it, then please do me a favor and hit the like button. And also, if you've been following my channel for a while and you feel that you've gotten a lot of value out of this, then you could also support what I'm doing by leaving me a super thanks down below. Thank you. So is it possible to cover this amount by working as a student or not? So we'll do a simulation about how much you can potentially earn as a student, but before we get into that, I want to familiarize you with some basics about working as a student in Canada. One thing is clear: as a student, you are allowed to work a certain number of hours on campus and off campus. But in order to do that, there are specific conditions. So if you want to make working as a student here in Toronto, Canada, as a significant part of your strategy to cover your living costs here, then I would highly encourage you to study this website in detail. In order to later on do your simulations about how much you can potentially earn as a student, you will need to know more about these requirements, what you can and what you cannot do. And guys, I cannot stress enough how important this is. As a student here in Canada, you really need to stick to the regulations about working as a student, because if you work illegally here, if you break the rules, then you can get sent back to your home country, and that will just mess up your whole plans, and you really don't want that. So now let's take a look at the very basic requirements. So here on this page, you can see that there is a section about working on campus as well as off campus, and there are different regulations to this. And let's just look at few of the major points. You can only start working in Canada when you start your study program. You can't work before your study begins. You can't work before your studies begin. So if, for example, your studies begin in September, but you already arrive here in Canada mid-July, it doesn't mean that you can work. You cannot work. You can only work when you officially start your study program. And then there are some further conditions. For example, you need to be a full-time post-secondary student. And here below, you can see which types of schools you need to be enrolled at if you want to be allowed to work. And of course, you also need to have a valid study permit and also a SIN number. But don't worry about the SIN number. As long as you have a valid study permit, it should be pretty easy to get that SIN number. And in fact, I also have another video about that here. And down below here, you'll also be able to find information on who cannot work on campus. For example, you cannot work anymore when you stop studying full-time or your study permit expires. And also some information on where you can work. You can work for your school, for faculty members, student organization, and so on. And at the very bottom, you'll see a section about how many hours you can work on campus. And here it says that you can work as many hours as you want in addition to working off campus, as long as you continue to meet the eligibility requirements for working on campus. So let's take a brief look at that. And the requirements are those that we just went through at the very top. Now let's move on to working off campus. So here again, it states that you cannot work before you start your studies. And here again are some eligibility requirements. You can work off campus with a work permit, but remember, you still need to have that study permit. If you meet all these requirements, including you're a full-time student at a designated learning institution, so you can click on that link to see whether or not the institution that you are planning to study at is a DLI. And you also need to be enrolled in a post-secondary program or a secondary level vocational training program for Quebec. Your study program must be at least 6 months long. If it's a 5 months long thing, then you will not be allowed to work. And it also has to lead to a degree, diploma, or certificate. You've started studying and you have a SIN number. Now let's skip to how many hours you are allowed to work off campus. And here there is a restriction. You can only work up to 20 hours per week during regular school term or semesters. And the great thing is, it says here that yes, you are allowed to work more than one job to make up these hours. So if you have one job where you work 5 hours per week and another job where you work 12 hours per week, that is still below the 20-hour per week limit. And below here, note that there are some exceptions for very limited timelines, so make sure that you read through this. Interestingly, during scheduled breaks, during breaks in the school year, you are allowed to work full-time, so more than 20 hours off campus. During scheduled breaks such as winter and summer holidays or fall or spring reading week, you are free to work overtime or work 2 part-time jobs that add up to a higher than usual number of hours. But again, here you still need to be a full-time student. So as you see here, sticking to these rules, you can actually work quite a number of hours. Another very important thing that I need to note here though, guys, is when you later on receive your study permit, there will be a statement about your eligibility to work. So make sure that you read that note and that you stick to it. So now that we understand the very basic rules for international students working during their study, now let's go on to the simulations. Let's do some concrete number examples. So guys, here I have an earning simulation for how much I can earn as student if. So the first thing we need to do is to pick an assumption for how many hours that you will work per week. And for this example, I will start off using 20 hours per week. And I know, guys, earlier in the regulations, I showed you that it said that you can work as many hours as you want in addition to working off campus. But I would say that realistically, on average, the number will not be much more than 20 hours. I mean, of course, during breaks, you might go up to 30 or even 40 hours or more, but then during the semester there will definitely be times during which you just do not have time to work, where you either work 0 hours or you only work 5 hours, perhaps you do not work at all for a couple of months, and so on. And guys, you also need to take into consideration that being employed consistently is not a guarantee. While you want to start working as soon as your studies start, you may not be able to immediately get a job, right? And that is why for this simulation I will start off using 20 hours per week. So let's input that 20 hours per week in example 1, and for pay per hour we also need to input an assumption, and for that let's just take the minimum wage in Ontario, which at the moment is $15.50. And with that, we arrive at a weekly income of 20 times 15.5 equals $310. So how much is that in a year? If a year has 52 weeks, let's assume that you work throughout the year except for 2 weeks where you're perhaps on vacation. So let's make that 50 weeks. That means that in total, you will be able to earn about $15,500 in a year. What about income taxes? Up to a certain income, you barely pay any taxes. For simplicity's sake, for the purpose of this video, I will just omit taxes, and let's just assume that this is your net take-home pay. So $15,500 per year. Let's compare that with our initial living cost number of $31,200. So that just covers like 50% of it. So not quite enough yet. Let's go on to example number 2. And here again, let's use 20 hours per week as your workload. And let's say that you got a job at a company that pays more than minimum wage. Let's say that you get $18.50. In that case, you will earn $370 per week. If we again assume 50 weeks worked per week, that amounts to $18,500, which is still a far cry away from the $31,200. Now let's go on to example number 3, still using 20 hours per week. Now let's assume that you have a very specific skill. Let's say that in your home country, you were a software engineer, so you do some freelance coding job for a company or for an individual. And although those kinds of jobs tend to pay higher, let's just assume for this example, because you are a student, you get paid $25 per hour. That means that per week, you will earn $500. At 50 weeks worked per year, that amounts to $25,000. So even in this scenario, still you would only earn $25,000. Okay guys, in this example, I do not want to increase the pay per hour any further. Now what we'll do is to tweak the number of hours per week. So let's set the number of hours per week at 30 hours per week, and let's go back to the minimum wage of $15.50. That means that per week you will earn $465, and at 50 weeks work per week, that's $23,250. Now let's level this up a bit. 30 hours per week at $18.50, that will earn you $555 per week. At 50 weeks worked, that is $27,750. So in this scenario, you will almost cover your living cost here in Toronto, but not quite. And it will be very risky to assume that you will be able to pull off this plan exactly. So personally, I would not rely on this panning out, but let's talk about that in a second. Let's now do another interesting simulation where we turn the numbers around. So here in this table, you see I'm gonna calculate how much do I need to earn, or how many hours do I need to work in order to cover that $31,200. So in example 1, we're gonna input $31,200. And again, let's assume 50 weeks work per year. And by the way, guys, I must say that using 50 as an assumption is actually quite aggressive, but I'll also address that in a second. So how much would you need to earn per week? Let's divide $31,200 by 50 weeks. That amounts to $624 per week that you would need to earn. At a minimum wage of $15.50, how many hours would you need to work per week? 624 divided by 1550 equals 40 hours per week, which I would say is impossible without jeopardizing your studies. So even if this were a possibility, even if you could work 40 hours per week throughout the year without fail for 50 weeks per year, this would be very, very risky. And this is why 40 hours per week is a full-time job. It is very, very difficult to work a full-time job while also studying. I know that there are some individuals who are highly, highly productive and who can do this, but this is not the majority. So you have to be very honest with yourself. You have to be honest about whether or not you are the type of person who can pull off this kind of thing, because most people can't. As you know, when you study, there are so many tests, there are assignments, and then there is group work, and then there are exams and so on, and you pay so much for your tuition fee that in the end you do want to get something out of your study. You want to be engaged in your studies, you want to hang out with other students and enjoy college life. So in any case, I find that working 40 hours per week while also studying full-time is unrealistic for the majority of people. And now again, let's play around a bit with this simulation. So to cover $31,200 at 50 weeks work per week, you need to earn $624 per week. If you can get yourself a job that pays $18.50 per hour, that means that you will need to work 33.7 hours per week. And still, this is very ambitious, very aggressive, and quite unlikely to maintain consistently over 50 weeks. Now let's do the third and last example. To earn this $624 per week, if you only had 20 hours per week to work, how much would you need to earn per hour? You would need to earn 624 divided by 20 equals $31.20 per hour. And again, this is quite unrealistic, especially if you're a new international student here in Canada. So I would not rely on this scenario coming through. So exceptions and outliers aside, which would be the realistic example to use? In my opinion, because you want to make sure that your studies run smoothly, that your studies will be continuous, and you will be able to continue living here in Canada and build your new life here, it's better to be on the conservative side. And for that, I would personally use example number 1, which is that you assume that you can work 20 hours per week at a minimum wage of $15.50. So that brings you to $15,500, which is about 50% of your living cost. I believe that that is the prudent approach. If in the end you can earn more and you can work more, then good for you. Then that will help your overall situation. But it's better to assume that you'll earn less rather than more so that you can prepare yourself in advance. Another thing that we also haven't considered yet is that the number $31,200 is the average current living cost in Toronto, which only covers the very basic costs. So depending on your lifestyle and depending on how inflation goes, that number can easily go up to $35,000 and so on. And also, remember, in our example, we assume that you are going to work for 50 weeks, whereas that might not always be the case. So how can you possibly earn a higher hourly rate? Let me share with you 2 jobs where you can possibly earn more than the minimum wage as a student, even though you do not have much experience. The first one is working in the food industry as a waiter, because as a waiter, you might be earning minimum wage, but you will be able to earn tips. The second thing that you can also do is find a job where you also get commissions. And I recently made a video about my experience working as a salesperson at a furniture store, and I'll link that video up here for you. You can watch that after you finish watching this, where I tell you about how much I earned as a salesperson and how much I earned in commissions. If you earn commissions, your total income is basically unlimited. It is only limited by your ability to sell stuff. So those are some ways where you can circumvent the minimum wage problem and earn more as a student. But again, I personally would not rely on that. Not from the beginning at the very least. So like I said before, I believe that it's realistic to assume that as a student, you can cover about 50% of your living costs. But, a huge but, not immediately in your first year of arriving here in Canada. The thing is that when you arrive here in Canada, you need to adjust to so many things, to the climate, to the way of life, to the language, to your studies and everything. There are so many things that you need to get settled, and you might not have that much time to look for a job or even work that job, right? And even if you look for a job, you might not be able to get a job from day one, from the first day of your study. So if, let's say, you arrive here in Canada in the summer or in the fall semester, I would just assume that for that year until the end of the year, your earnings are zero. So make sure that you have enough funds saved to cover your tuition fee and also your living costs until the end of the year, because I would say that that is the adaptation phase during which perhaps you will not have a job yet. Then in the next year, in the first full year of your studies, then you can start assuming that you can cover 10 to 30% of your living cost. So if your living costs are $31,200 without tuition, if you can cover 10% of that from working, it means that you'll get $3,120, and the remainder is $28,000, which you will need to save. $28,000, which you need to save before coming to Canada. And then you might say, whoa, this is a very big amount. And I know it is so challenging. It is so challenging to come to Canada and study and make the finances work, etc. But if you are someone who is very, very determined and you are a hard worker, then go ahead and assume 30%. So let's assume 30%, and let's say that in your first full year of studying here, you can earn $9,360, and the remainder will be $21,840. And yes, that is still a huge amount of money. But it will not go on like that forever. That is just the first year. In your first year, remember, it might be still difficult for you to find that job. There will be a lot of trial and error and so on. But if you're lucky, if you're very hardworking, perhaps you might already be able to cover 50 or 70% of your expenses in the first year. What I'm saying is just that you should not rely on that. It is better to prepare more funds up front. And if you can earn more, then that's a bonus. Now let's go on to year 2. In year 2, you're already more settled, you already know your environment, you have more connections, you already had your first work experience, so it will be much easier for you to stay employed and perhaps also to get paid more. So for year 2, go ahead and assume that you will be able to cover 50 to 70% of your living costs. Let's just take 60%. That would mean that you'd be able to cover $18,720 from working as a student, with a remaining $12,500. Now let's go on to year 3. Let's now say that in year 3 you will be able to cover 85% of your living costs, meaning that you earn $26,500 from working as a student, which leaves you with $4,680 to cover from your own fund. So in total, and guys, here for year 0, I'm going to make an adjustment because I'm assuming that here in year 0, you're not arriving in January, but let's say that you arrive in the fall semester and there are only like 3 months left. And that is why I'm going to divide this number by 4, because you only need to cover your living costs for a fourth of the year, which amounts to $7,000. And now let's sum up all of these numbers. And here we have it. If you're more conservative, if you want to be more on the safe side, then save up $46,000 before you come to Canada and then earn the rest to cover your living cost from working as a student. Now, what if your projections are more aggressive? If you're really determined, you already had a lot of work experience, and you've told yourself that you will do what it takes to get through this, then you can use more aggressive assumptions. For example, in year 0, I will still put 10%. In year 1, I put 60%, and then in year 2, 85%, and in the last year, 100%. And this brings the number down to $25,000. So this scenario is rather aggressive, but it's not impossible. But overall, I think based on my own experience, this is still realistic. The condition is just that you are not too picky about choosing jobs, and that if you cannot find the job that you want, you are still willing to accept less ideal job. For example, working at a fast food joint and so on. So guys, to summarize the big question, can you or can you not cover your living expenses as a student here in Toronto, Canada by working as a student? My answer is partially. Do not rely on it in the first year that you arrive here, whereas for the second, third, fourth year, you can assume that you can cover approximately 50% of your living costs as a student from working as a student, being conservative again. So in case you guys don't know yet, when I came here to Canada, we went for a postgraduate certificate, which only lasts 1 year, so we spent much less money. But if I were to come to Canada as an undergraduate student for longer studies, I would make sure that I would have at least 30 to 50% of the living costs prepared in savings before even coming to Canada. So if you need more time to save up money to come to Canada, it might take you a bit longer, but the benefit is that you will then have a peace of mind. You will be less pressured and feel less stressed out about the whole situation. So guys, I hope this video was useful to you. Please let me know your questions in the comments below, and I'll try my best to get back to you. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I'll see you in the next video.